I've been on a big wrestling kick lately, getting into classic TNA.
I'm a genetic freak, and I'm not normal!
And even 1990s All Japan, and I've been feeling nostalgic. The first SmackDown vs. Raw game on PS2 is one of the first wrestling games I can remember really getting into. I spent so much time on it as a kid, messing around with stuff and just really getting into it. I figured now's as good a time as any to revisit it and see how it goes. I loved it as a kid, but does it actually hold up outside of nostalgia, or is this one memory better left alone? Let's take a look. There will be spoilers. The early 2000s were a crazy time for professional wrestling. The beginning of the 1990s had seen the death of the Hulkamania era, and both WWE and its competition WCW struggled with the end of the golden age that was the 1980s. It was a dark time. 1996 saw WCW introduce the New World Order storyline, and 1997 saw WWE build itself around the Stone Cold Steve Austin-Mr. McMahon rivalry. In the end, WCW's incompetence, along with the corporate structure they were a part of, led them to be sold to McMahon in March 2001. And having bought the competition, WWE were now the undisputed kings of wrestling. The business wasn't as hot now that there was no competition. As Eric Bischoff would say, competition creates controversy, and controversy creates cash. But for a time, WWE reaped the benefits. Many wrestlers came over from WCW, along with many others from the recently folded ECW, and WWE even tried to create competition internally by splitting the roster into two totally distinct and separate shows. For a time, this worked, but such an idea only works if you have enough wrestlers to make it work. We're now in the year 2004. Many of the really big stars like Hogan, Steiner, DDP, Goldberg, and others are gone or will be gone after WrestleMania. And of course, how could I forget, Stone Cold retired and The Rock went to go to Hollywood full-time. And WWE also lost arguably their biggest homegrown star at the time, as Brock Lesnar would leave for the NFL. SmackDown got hit the worst as Lesnar left, and its other top two villains were out hurt, but Raw struggled as well. The sudden main event pushes of John Bradshaw Layfield and Randy Orton, a bunch of makeshift tag teams trying to replace established teams, lots of terrible big guys and directionless lower card talents nobody cared about. It's rough, especially on SmackDown. The less we say about 2004 SmackDown, the better. It was a dark time. SmackDown vs. Raw was the sixth WWE game developed by Yuke to be released on PlayStation consoles. The previous 5 games were branded the SmackDown series, and that series ended on a high note with Here Comes the Pain, one of the greatest wrestling games ever. Add to that the background of what's happening in real-life WWE, and this game is fighting an uphill battle from the start. SmackDown vs. Raw tried to create a more interactive and realistic wrestling experience that better recreates WWE TV. But did it succeed? Let's jump into Exhibition and get our feet wet. The gameplay is very similar to the previous game. X in various directions on the D-pad does strikes, triangle runs, square interacts with stuff, and circle in a direction initiates one of several different lockups. Wrestlers have a damage indicator showing what your moves are targeting, and if the limb is red, that means a submission targeting that limb will definitely make them tap out. If their head has red damage, then certain moves targeting the head can also cause bleeding. Doing stuff to your opponent builds momentum, and eventually it'll fill your meter up and you'll earn a finisher. Get your opponent in the right situation, and L1 will do your finisher. L2 reverses strikes, R2 reverses grapples. Down and circle to a downed opponent pins them. Beat the opponent up until you can win by pinfall, submission, knockout, or DQ. You get the idea. Like I said, it's basically Here Comes the Pain, but it's not exactly the same. Right off the bat, it's a little slower. It's not like the game is in slow motion or anything, but it is definitely slower. To help further the interactivity of the game while recreating part of the WWE presentation, singles matches now usually open with a minigame. A stare down, a test of strength, or a shoving contest are classic spots to open up a match, and there's also one where you can trade chops in the corner. At first, these are cool. The problem is, these get really repetitive after a while. You can turn off the ones that start matches in the match rules, but the chop battle can't be turned off. And unfortunately, that minigame is initiated by pressing down and circle to an opponent in the corner. This means every single wrestler shares that minigame, so all the wrestlers feel a little more samey than they used to. This is hardly the only place where the game loses some of the depth from Here Comes the Pain, but we'll talk more about that later. Another really cool thing is that now when you choose a wrestler, you can choose if you want to wrestle clean or dirty. There's now a second meter that you can fill up during gameplay by doing clean or dirty tactics, and it'll decrease if you use tactics that don't match your choice. Clean wrestlers try to please fans with fair wrestling, flashy high-flying moves, and showing off. Dirty wrestlers are the cheating assholes you love to hate, exposing the turnbuckle to hurt their opponents, holding on to submission moves after rope breaks, and generally being poor sports. If you can fill the meter, you'll do a taunt and enter a special state for a bit. Clean wrestlers hulk up and are invincible, plus finishers will do extra damage. Dirty wrestlers can hit a super powerful low blow, which is basically a finisher. Actually, usually you can hit this a couple of times. Ultimately, the clean-dirty thing is neat, and I really like how it helps further distinguish different wrestlers. Guys like Ric Flair are perfect dirty characters, while more technical or high-flying guys like Rey Mysterio are great clean characters. But it's mostly just a cute gimmick. It doesn't really add that much to the game considering that it's totally optional. If you actually want to use it, you'll have to think about what moves to use and how to play. But unlike the minigames, if you don't like the system, you can just ignore it and the core gameplay is the same. So at least it's not intrusive. Personally, I'm a big fan of heel wrestlers, so I have a good time when I get to cheat and argue with the ref. Nice guys finish last. So while the gameplay is slightly slower than Here Comes the Pain, you've still got a snappy, fun wrestling game in its own right. There's also plenty of match types. Singles, tags, multi-man matches, main events like Hell in a Cell or First Blood or the Elimination Chamber, even bra and panties if you're really into PS2 character models. The hardcore match returns, along with the new Parking Lot Brawl, which is basically just the hardcore match again. It's not as crazy as earlier hardcore modes, as you only get a couple of areas to fight in and you can't roam from area to area anymore. This is also the last appearance of the Slobber Knocker mode. I always really liked this mode. You pick a wrestler and then you wrestle a bunch of guys back to back in a gauntlet, either trying to beat as many people as possible within a time limit, or wrestling until someone defeats you. The twist is that the speed is cranked up. While gameplay itself is at the same speed, your momentum fills quickly, and finishers and even strong moves will often knock opponents out and keep things moving at a really quick pace. While the earlier faster-paced games fit this mode better, it's still fun here. You can't go wrong with just jumping in and beating up a bunch of guys. Now it's time for me to complain about the roster. This is one of the biggest flaws of this game. So many unimportant lower card guys like Chuck Palumbo, Hardcore Holly, and Scotty 2 Hotty who haven't been relevant in years. Young guys getting squandered like Rene Dupree and Mark Jindrak, and a bunch of filler tag teams. If you like women's wrestling, this game is not for you. There's only 5 women total. The only real dedicated tag teams here are the Dudleys and the unlockable Legion of Doom. Even the legends on offer leave a lot to be desired. LOD, Roddy Piper, Jimmy Snuka, and a slightly different zombie Undertaker returns. The Rock returns from the previous game, but now he's a legend. Masked Kane, Andre the Giant, Bret Hart, Mankind, and the greatest wrestler who ever lived, Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Wait a minute, Brutus Beefcake? We can't get the $1 Million Man or Sheiky Baby? And where's Stone Cold? A WWE game without Stone Cold just doesn't sound right. I can't really fault Yuke's here because they had to work with what WWE had, but man, 2004's roster was bad. It was a dark time. The last thing I want to talk about in Exhibition is the challenges. Like the previous games, you can play through the season mode to get money and unlock stuff. But but you can also play these challenges to get money for unlockables. The challenges offer a lot of variety, and these give an incentive to keep playing Exhibition, since now you can unlock stuff in Exhibition. There are 4 sets of challenges that increase in difficulty and complexity as you go through them. Beating all the first level challenges unlocks the heat and velocity arenas, but otherwise these are pretty much optional. But really, the bread and butter of PS2 WWE games is the season mode. Playing through a year of WWE shows is a great way to unlock the various goodies the game has locked away, and you can have some fun with the craziness of the storylines. So, how does SmackDown vs. Raw do with its season mode? Well, the season mode is a weak point for the game. A lot of the game's flaws and limitations are painfully evident, and we see just how shallow this game really is. You choose a wrestler to play through a year of WWE shows, starting right after WrestleMania and wrapping up at next year's WrestleMania. Wrestlers are part of Raw or SmackDown, which are separate shows with different wrestlers, championships, and pay-per-view events. Some wrestlers start with a championship, while others don't. A new feature is that now we have voice acting. How good is that? We'll see. As a wrestler without a title, you'll play through storylines like feuding with someone over Tori Wilson. Another one is wrestling a series of matches for a good entry number into the Royal Rumble.
And you know, Kane, the higher your number, the better chance you have of winning the Royal Rumble.
When you win enough matches, you can challenge for a championship, and you'll feud with the champ for a month. Playing with or without a championship comes with its own set of storylines. Sounds pretty nice, right?
He wants your title in an ultimate submission match at Judgment Day.
Different storylines based on if you're the champ or not sounds pretty good. And since both shows have different wrestlers, things should have nice variety, right? Wrong. The different shows ultimately amount to a reskin and different voice acting. And since there's only 5 women, they'll be the same in either story. You'll feud with a mid-carder for Tori Wilson's services and all that sort of stuff. If you're a champion, you'll go through similar storylines like multi-man cage matches against potential challengers, or a unification match at WrestleMania. It's nice to have an interpromotional story unifying the championships, especially as the big climax at WrestleMania. But this happens regardless of the show you're on and regardless of what belt you have. I get unifying the top titles, but it's really lazy to recycle this for the mid-card belts. Surely they could have had something interesting for those, but no. Even worse, you can't wrestle as a woman, so you don't get to wrestle in the women's division at all. You can't wrestle for the Cruiserweight Championship, so no fun stories and matches with those guys, and you can't wrestle for tag team titles either. What the hell happened? For a game that's trying to recreate WWE TV, they're sure doing a good job of not recreating it. Even if the tag teams in the game and in real life suck, it would have at least offered some variety for the season mode. And it feels like I'm strictly on rails. I don't really have a say in anything except on if I'm going to be a good guy or a bad guy. When I played my second season using Christian on Raw, I wanted to go through an entire year without winning a belt. I wrestled a bunch in January and got a really high entry number into the Royal Rumble. But I didn't want to wait around forever for the bots to finally eliminate each other so I could enter the match and win, and I didn't want to win the title anyway, so I just skipped it so I would forfeit. Then I got forced into a storyline for the Intercontinental Championship. Normally that would be great, but I don't want to win a belt, that's the whole point.
So what do you think? Feel like challenging for the Intercontinental title?
How about letting me play the game how I want to, guys? So what kind of epic finale did I get for trying to change things up? Chris Benoit and Kane go through Trish Stratus's bags and steal her underwear.
Well, I'm more interested in what she looks like out of them.
So Christian and Shawn Michaels end a rivalry with Kane and Benoit at WrestleMania in a ladder match for Trish's undies. Man, between this and perving in the women's locker room, the storylines in this game are ridiculously horny if you're not the champion. You don't have a lot of wrestlers to play with, and the uneven roster really shows here. Generally, I think the Raw season is tougher, since Raw actually has stars. And unlike Here Comes the Pain, you can't customize the rosters at all. They even brought back the thing where you can carry over your season data from one run to another, but it's worse now because you can only do it as the same wrestler. Otherwise, you're stuck with the default season, default rosters, champions, everything, and that's all you're ever gonna get. Since you have to run through season more than one time to unlock everything, this is not great. Season mode is an acceptable time killer. It's competently developed, it's not glitchy, it's not gonna crash, it's not gonna bug out or anything, but otherwise it's nothing to write home about. It's shallow, repetitive, underwhelming, and ultimately disappointing. If you want a good season mode, play Shut Your Mouth or Here Comes the Pain. You're not getting it here. Before I give my final thoughts on SmackDown vs. Raw, I want to cover a couple of odds and ends first. The graphics and presentation have gotten a lot better. The lighting has improved, the animations have improved, and wrestlers have gotten a nice new coat of paint thanks to having better, more detailed models. Just look at someone like Chris Benoit or Ric Flair and compare this year's model to last year's model, and it's a pretty big difference. This might be one of the only good things about that shallow roster. More resources can go to making the wrestlers that are here look as good as possible. I also want to praise the opening movie for doing a great job setting the mood and hyping you up for the game. We see clips from the previous 5 SmackDown games as a narrator talks about past generations and future generations. Then we get to see clips of the game in action set to The Way It Is by Powerman 5000. And speaking of Powerman 5000, the game's soundtrack is really good. Unlike the previous SmackDown games, SmackDown vs. Raw uses licensed tracks by artists like Breaking Benjamin, Zebrahead, and Powerman 5000, even during cutscenes and matches. It really put a smile on my face when I first started playing this game again, and I heard stuff like Firefly, When Worlds Collide, and Bring the Noise. I can't play any of this stuff for obvious reasons, but you don't have to take my word for it. Go on YouTube and check out the soundtrack. You won't regret it. As always, we have creation modes. I'm not really into create a superstar in WWE games because no matter how much I try to do, the wrestlers are always going to look out of place next to real wrestlers, but there's a lot of options here. If you like creating wrestlers, you can do a lot. Create a moveset is back, and it's as robust as ever. And you can still create a stable if you really want to do something with these wrestlers. They got rid of create an animation. Now we have create a pay-per-view and create a championship. You can make a show or play one of the presets recreating earlier WWE pay-per-views, and you'll get to see a little hype package for the show. Season mode also uses these little hype packages. As for created championships, I couldn't remember ever doing anything with them as a kid, and now I can see why. You need to have a lot of money just to even make one, let alone make one that looks halfway decent, and you can only use them in custom shows, so it's really just a waste of time. It's a shame you can't have title matches with the real belts, but what can you do? SmackDown vs. Raw offers a glimpse of what Ukes could do with their PS2 WWE games by moving from frantic arcadey gameplay to a more realistic feel. Unfortunately, it fails in a few key areas.
Yeah, I don't usually give a damn what this guy thinks, but he's right.
The roster is painfully underwhelming. Do you really want to be Garrison Cade or Brutus Beefcake? Yeah, me neither. And the season mode highlights just how unbalanced the roster is. Raw actually has stars, while SmackDown has a couple of stars and a bunch of Raw's mid-level guys as filler. The action is still good, but I think it's a little weaker this time. They added some repetitive mini-games and a neat but totally irrelevant dirty/clean dynamic, and that's about it. A slower, weightier wrestling game can be fun, but there's not really anything to make the wrestling more complex or fun here. It might look more like a WWE match, but it still doesn't really simulate being in one. Now, it's not bad. You could really do way worse when it comes to wrestling gameplay, but this just feels like a poor man's Here Comes the Pain. The season mode is a real pitfall as we've gone from something that was really deep and fun and replayable to something that's shallow, uninteresting, and at best, it's mediocre. While there's some nice graphics and cool music and other little distractions to mess with, window dressing will only get you so far. It's the beginning of a new day for WWE games on the PS2, but while there's a solid concept here, it's going to take another game to really develop that concept. And in 2004, WWE is in a rough place. Between this and trying to follow up Here Comes the Pain, SmackDown vs. Raw wasn't exactly set up to succeed. What we've got here is decent, but nothing more than that. WWE SmackDown vs. Raw. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. If you have any thoughts on SmackDown vs. Raw, I'd love to talk about it in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.